hosting Professor Anupam Guha for our IFF in Conversation series today. While many of you may already be aware of Professor Guha and his excellent work in the field, please allow me to introduce him briefly for those of you who may not know him. Professor Guha is an assistant professor at the Center for Policy Studies at IIT Bombay. He is an AI researcher who is interested in AI policy, the interaction of labor with AI, and political economy of automation. Today, we will be discussing his new paper on workplace surveillance titled The Automated Workplace, Digital Taylorism in India. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Anushka, for hosting me, and really looking forward to this.
Thank you. Before we go ahead, I just want to tell you everyone that this event is being live streamed for the public to watch. However, after we're done with the conversation, we will turn off the live stream and allow IFF members to ask questions to Professor Guha directly. So if you want to participate in future conversations at IFF, please consider becoming a member today. So let's just get started. Before we get into the paper itself, I wanted to ask you, Professor Guha, about the history of workplace surveillance in India. Surely workplace surveillance was rampant even before AI technology got involved.
Definitely. In fact, as I have mentioned in this paper, there is a long culture of how surveillance became normalized, and not just surveillance. So surveillance is only a part of what we are talking about here. What is more interesting, and what is this phrase, digital Taylorism, which the paper talks about. So this phrase, it actually builds on the concept of Taylorism. Taylorism is this idea by this American businessman and workplace administrator Taylor. Long time back, he came up with this idea that you could scientifically manage the workplace, and that would lead to more productivity, right? You can observe workers, you could measure how much they are producing, you could really observe them at a very granular level and measure their output at a very granular level, and hence control their wages. That was the original idea. And then this idea was rediscovered because digital technology became common in the early 2000s, and especially in the BPO sector, this call center, this outsourced work sector, which India got involved in. Over there, we start to see this attempt at observing the employee behavior, measuring their activities, even when they get out of the cubicle, when they sit down, the alleys they walk through, swiping cards, RFIDs, cameras measuring their every step. Then you had rubrics and protocols which are constantly evaluating, are they doing the things correctly or not, etc. The argument which I'm trying to make in this paper is that the central vanity of all of this, that you are measuring it, that it's a scientific way of running the workplace, which will increase productivity. The argument I'm making is that that is nonsense, that this has nothing to do with productivity. This has nothing to do with scientific management, the central claim of Taylorism and now of digital Taylorism, but rather it's an arbitrary terror mechanism to keep the employees constantly jumpy, to make them aware that all of their actions are being monitored. And this doesn't really have much to do with scientific output. I'm not saying that people who invented these protocols all the way from the early 2000s, even before, as you said, automation did not exist, I'm not saying these were malicious people. Probably they believe in what they do, this automated human resources management stuff. They probably still believe in what they do, but there is enough evidence and enough history to make the case that the technologies they are doing are fundamentally arbitrary, that the rubrics they are using are not at all scientific, and what actually they are creating, and the reason they are witnessing higher productivity or profit or what have you, is because the workers are more strained, is because they are more exploited, it is because they are more wary of speaking out against such managerial practices. And hence, they are not as, in colloquial parlance, they are not as uppity anymore. And hence, you see more profits, and you attribute that to, oh, now we are scientific, now we are more productive. Not really. What you are doing is now you are better at exploiting, and you are better at shutting up the people in various ways. And how that happens is what this paper is about. So yes, it historicizes these things way before AI even comes into the picture, but then it shows how does AI sort of manages to scale and amplify these processes. And now you have all kinds of new tools to run a workplace like this, especially post pandemic, when people were more okay with their liberties being taken away because there was an quote unquote emergency.
I completely agree with you. And just to make sure that everybody understands, can you actually explain and break down the term digital Taylorism in the sense that what exactly are the AI technologies that are being used to surveil workers in workplaces, and how is it being enabled specifically in Indian workplaces? If you could
Right.
give us an
I'll do.
example.
So, like I mentioned, to understand digital Taylorism, you have to first understand Taylorism. Taylorism was also called scientific management. And it is something that the idea was, it became very popular in the factories of Henry Ford, the famous car manufacturer, that in order to get the maximum out of workers, you have to measure every little act they do and pay them accordingly, right? So earlier, what used to happen before Taylorism came into the picture, that there was a lot of self-management of workers in factories. Workers could decide how they would run the place, and the owners would tell them what they wanted, and the workers would do that thing, right? But when Taylorism came into the picture, all that flew out of the window. You had professional managers, and the factory floor basically became and like an army barracks. You got instructions, and the workers did that instructions. Now, initially, like I said, it was peddled as this new scientific way of running factories. And even the workers were not completely against it initially, because there was a lot of arbitrariness in global capitalism. And now, you had this way of measuring productivity. So the workers also thought that, if this can be measured, we can also measure the salary we can demand. So this became sort of this measuring contest between the managers on one side and the trade union on the other side. So much so that even countries which did not consider themselves capitalist, like so-called socialist countries, like the erstwhile USSR, for example, they also adopted Taylorist practices. They got experts from America, and Taylorism became like everybody's adopted Taylorism. Even India adopted when India became independent. We got these practices in our factories. And then what happens is that we jump to the 90s. You have a sudden influx of BPOs, of call centers, of these companies. And I'm sorry, I think you are frozen, or am I frozen?
No, I can hear you perfectly.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It seemed for a second that somehow the screen was frozen. What we see around that time is that you have now digital interventions at the workplace. You have, for example, cameras in the workplace. This is the first time you are seeing direct surveillance of the workplace in that sense. And you have rubrics being developed on how to measure productivity. After a few decades, when machine learning becomes a technology, and for people who are hearing, machine learning is the dominant area of artificial intelligence. It basically means that given data, you find patterns to make decisions. Well, now you have a lot of employee data to find patterns from. So what are the kind of machine learning systems that were used and are being used? First of all, you had you even the AI part of it begins in a very sterile peaceful, innocent manner. Like nobody thought that the end point would be invasive monitoring or any such thing. The first interventions of AI, if you look at the publications, for example, the first interventions were, okay, can we using machine learning and statistics predict which product is going to be success, which project is going to be a success, which employee is going to be successful at what they do given their past history of actions, right? Then slowly that goes to, can we use machine learning to hire people, right? Now this is not exactly digital Taylorism, because hiring is still not a workplace activity. You are still interacting with people who are technically not your employees, but you see problems right at that very outset. Why? Because machine learning is excellent if you want to replicate the past. The past, unfortunately, is something that sometimes you don't want to replicate. If you have a history of HR people discriminating against women, for example, which is common in so many companies, especially large companies, and you use a machine learning algorithm to filter resumes, what is going to happen? It will replicate past patterns. This is not a hypothetical case. This happened with Amazon's attempt to automate their hiring process. Turns out that the machine learning algorithm was completely discriminating women, and they had to shut that down when this whole thing came out. And then slowly from the periphery of the company, you see the monitoring and the behavior modification practices using AI coming inside the company. What are some of these technologies? Well, first of all, we see the idea of facial recognition tech, that we are going to automate the monitoring that was already happening with camera. Now you have facial recognition tech around. Now there are various problems with facial recognition tech, which we'll not go into detail because this is not a workshop on facial recognition tech, but the very basic problem with it is that it's stochastic. It is something which uses patterns. So it's probabilistic, it's not determined, which means that if you're observing for something, you will make errors, and you will make wrong errors at wrong time. So if you are like monitoring certain undesirable behaviors of employees, you might get false positives and all sorts of things. And then we go to like straight away behavior modification stuff, biometrics, and extremely invasive stuff. Now, the thing with India is that India doesn't have a law against harmful AI use cases. We don't have a law, for example, against facial recognition tech in areas where it should not be used. For example, policing. We don't have any such law. Similarly, we don't have law for in a workplace what level of surveillance can be done or cannot be done, and what are the consequences of that. You see machine learning technology and biometric technology being used as wearable sensors, cameras, and biometric mechanism on, for example, blue collar laborers. Again, always begins innocently. Began because there was a COVID pandemic happening, and they wanted to make sure that the factory workers are maintaining a certain degree of physical distance. But then it goes from there to, okay, can we measure what they are doing? Can we look at them? And then it becomes, then it starts to become harmful, because there was a publication which was looking at, for example, textile mill workers, that you have cases of, for example, sexual harassment. You have managers and foremen having the power to observe vulnerable workers. You then have even more weird cases. There is a municipality in Panchkula, which is one of those smart city endeavors, etc. And you have the workers there, the sanitation workers there, wearing all kinds of biometrics, cameras, sensors, etc. They have to even take the sensors home, which means even when they're not at their workplace, their behavior is being recorded. And the journalists whose article I quoted in the paper on the Panchkula incident, they went and talked to the municipality people, and they asked them, where is the data being stored? Is it at least secure? And the officers did not know, because the officers had completely outsourced the whole machine learning. The thing with machine learning is that it's a sophisticated piece of technology. So on one side, you have a complete policy vacuum. You don't have laws governing what is legitimate use and what is not legitimate use. On the other side, you have this enthusiasm from officialdom. Companies come to them, tell them that, oh, our technology can do this, do that, improve productivity, etc., etc., which is all snake oil. It is complete and utter fraud. But if you are a bureaucrat, how do you even know, right? They say, okay, AI, machine learning, they say these phrases, and the babus get completely bowled over, and they're like, okay, this is it. This is the future. We want to do it like that. Then you go and ask them, so do you know where the data is being stored? We don't know. Do you know that is it secure? We don't know. Do you know how this piece of thing works? We don't know. You are measuring their behavior with in a very invasive manner. It's not ethical. Well, we don't know. We were just told by a company that this is a good thing and we should use it. So we use it because, so there are a lot of levels around which these sort of things become normal. And the final level, I would say, is where they become completely and utterly false and pseudoscientific and hogwash. So then there are companies which claim that their machine learning can tell you being the HR manager of a company, which of your employees has what emotions, which of them are irritable, which of them are capricious, which of them are going to harass their fellow worker. This is all fraud. No AI can tell what your emotions are. Emotion detection is astrology. Emotion detection is fraud. Emotion detection is homeopathy. All right. It is, I would rather take sugar pills of homeopathy than believe that emotion detection works. It does not work. But there is a large community of AI researchers who think that it works. They think so because, being very good AI scientists, they never thought of consulting with psychologists or people who actually understand how the mind works, that, hey, our technology, does it even make sense? Because it doesn't. You can't look at somebody's facial expression and tell them what their inner thoughts are. But think about it as an HR professional. You are being told that you can magically suss out which of your employees are going to make trouble. And you know whether or not it works, it doesn't matter, as long as the employees think that it works. Because if they think that you can tell what their inner thoughts are, they will behave. They will not unionize. They will not file RTIs. They will not protest unethical work conditions. They will probably shut up if you are firing somebody in an incorrect fashion. That is how the whole ecosystem sort of creeps from fairly benign usages to extremely invasive and, in certain senses, false and fudgy usages. That is the whole ecosystem. I hope that that was of some help to people who are trying to understand this.
Definitely. Actually, you touched upon a lot of my questions that I was going to ask you, but I'm still going to ask you because I think we need more context around everything that you've just said. And I do remember reading. I think it was the Internet Democracy Project, which came out with the CCTV in the Mills wala, that example that you use. So I do remember thinking about how they are actually harmful, and not actually going to help either the people who are using them or the people who on whom they're going to be used. Which leads me to my next question as well, which you did touch upon, I think, at the end of your last answer. How does the use of such surveillance technology in the workplace lead to a suppression of workers' rights and perpetuate structural power asymmetries, like you've mentioned in your paper as well?
So if you go to the last section of my paper, where I talk about existing laws, what becomes really clear is that there are none, right? India does not have the sort of laws to think about or regulate these kind of technologies. If tomorrow I make an extremely invasive piece of surveillance tech using machine learning, suppose I make a machine learning tech which claims that it can look at your video or your face and tell whether you are a cisgendered person or a trans person. This would be extremely unethical by any given metric, right? There's not a single power in the country which can stop me if I want to do this. This is like no ethics board or law or anything really exists which can tell me that this is wrong. There's really nothing which can practically stop me. And it would be commercially viable because there would be a market of bigots who would want to use it against their employees, etc., etc. Like I can think of like 10 different ways in which a thing like that would be completely viable. So the first thing that we need to understand is that there is absolute policy vacuum when it comes to these things. There is no law in India right now which governs the use cases of machine learning. There are attempts to make data protection laws, but as we all know, even they have not materialized yet. We still don't have the personal data protection. Like it's still a bill, it's not a law yet, right? And as everybody knows, that bill itself is extremely controversial. Its present form is very diluted from the original draft which was made by the Justice Shri Krishna committee, to the point that Justice Shri Krishna himself said that the current variant of the draft as it exists is not going to really achieve much. It is not going to do what it was supposed to do. But even that does not exist yet, and there is no law. If we look at it from the labor law point of view, that can we use some variant of the labor law to protect the rights of the workers against these kind of things? Not really, because the labor laws themselves recently have been diluted to a very significant extent. And as my paper argues, these are things that you can't solve by just tightening data protection. Data protection is not enough when the problem isn't just that whether or not privacy exists. Had this just been about privacy, perhaps data protection would have been enough. But like I said, a lot of the purpose of this technology is to modify behavior. It's to restructure tasks that are at the workplace in a way that, so Taylorism works like this, that you want your task to be so small that the worker is measurable doing that task. Now, this has some downstream consequences. If you make your tasks in that manner, that the whole point is to observe the worker, the task becomes small and interchangeable. What that means is that your worker is being made to do dumb, skill-less, repetitive tasks. And this is ideal for the employer because the more repetitive and simplified the task is, the more replaceable the worker becomes. So even if your worker leaves you tomorrow or goes on a strike, from the employer point of view, that's completely fine because the task has been converted into an easily observable, measurable, simple, repetitive task, right? But this is bad. From a country point of view, an economy point of view, this is bad because what you are prolonging and what you are incentivizing is de-skilling of your workforce. The more these technologies spread, the dumber and less skilled your average worker becomes. Think about platforms. Earlier, we had tasks which had like a significant amount of skill involved. Then platforms came. So suppose you take the person who goes around delivering your food for Zomato. This person's existence would not have been possible had machine learning not existed. Because without machine learning, you couldn't have churned the data which makes a food carrier platform possible, right? But what is the job exactly? Is the job teaching any new skill to the worker? Is the job making the worker more employable or more valuable? Not really. Because the way this whole system works, if you want to observe the worker, you want the worker to not become a complex self-actualized agent. You want your worker to be a dumb drone, right? Now, if you are at an economy level, creating jobs which are basically dumb drone jobs, and if you are basically pushing your entire economy to go towards platforms which are enabled by machine learning, you see, there is the old worry about AI that AI would take jobs. In fact, I remember when I graduated from my PhD with a degree in AI, I also used to worry like that. I wrote a whole op-ed in sorry, not Times of India, I think Indian Express, very worried that AI will take away jobs. But as I observed the economy and as I talked to economists and as I thought more about AI policy over the years, what I've realized is that it's not so much that jobs would be automated, but that jobs would be dumbed down, and your wages would start to polarize as the jobs get dumbed down. Because why would you pay a lot to platform workers, right, whom you don't even consider real workers? Because these companies, they keep using this language: associate, partner, champion, captain. It's very, very despicable, but they get away with it, right? Only in some countries, in some jurisdictions, have lawyers become smart enough to fight that game. I think lawyers everywhere need to like really observe very carefully what these companies are doing. But at a technological level, what you are spreading is the gradual weakening of the employee. And because the employee is gradually weakening, because the employee is gradually being surveilled all the time, because the employee is being measured, and because the employee is separated from the other employee, especially in the whole work from home. So COVID has been wonderful for these companies, by the way. Like, from business point of view, COVID has enabled them to sell all these products because suddenly you had work from home, right? So anyway, all the employees were at their home, and suddenly the market for these products were spiking, basically. So you have an employee who is ill trained, deliberately being de-skilled, alone, does not know who their colleagues are, and is aware they are being constantly surveilled. Even when they're working on their laptop, which tabs they are opening is being looked at. Random screenshots are being taken at times and sent to their manager. All of this is in the paper. I'm not going to like go through all the gory details, but it's a level of surveillance and measurement and behavior modification, which, as the paper argues, it's not just bad for the economy and bad for human rights and bad for worker rights, but at a very individual level. Imagine the sheer stress, the harm of mental health you are doing on an employee. They are aware that there is a software monitoring my keystrokes. There is a software monitoring which tab I open. The camera of my laptop is looking at my gaze, right? That is the level at which we have reached. There have been studies done, not in the Indian context, but in the American context, etc., which I have referred in my paper, of how this leads to complete breakdown of trust in the workplace. It leads to weird and bad psychological effects on the employees. And of course, there are the macro effects, like I said: tearing down of worker agency power, skill, weakening of trade unions, weakening of the general economy towards a more polarized, unequal sort of polity. So
I think I completely agree with what you just said. I think if I could just condense that thought into one term, I think what you're describing is the creation of a digital panopticon, basically. That all the time workers are being surveilled. They don't know when they are being surveilled. So their entire behavior is modified because of the constant surveillance, which also has an effect on their internal health or their mental health. But even though AI researchers like yourself and civil society organizations and other stakeholders have been continuously criticizing everything that's happening, the use of surveillance technology has been increasing, not just all over the world, but especially in India. So this is not just for the workplace, but also generally. Why do you think that is? What is the reason behind this uptake? What is the reason behind this trend wherein the use has increased so exponentially in the past year, not just in the pandemic years, but even before
but
that?
yes, in 2016, I gave a talk on AI and its social impact in Delhi. And after that talk, there was a bureaucrat of TRI in the audience, and he said something which I will never forget. He said, "You are talking to the wrong people." He said that you are giving this talk in this, really elite space, and you have these very reasonable people who would listen to you. But he said that ultimately, these things are connected to A, the rights of the masses, their economic exploitation, and B, the politics surrounding it, because how they are used changes the politics of the country. And he said at the end of the day, without the proper laws and regulations, you can't fight this. You can't fight this as a policy wonk. That is not possible. You have to fight it at a political level. And a thing doesn't become a political fight till the masses are concerned with it, till it becomes a vote bank issue. The problem with the discourse around AI in particular and digital rights in general is that I believe that in India, leave alone academia, because academia is not really that involved in the policy discourse, it has become a very elite think tank conversation. You have the same 5, 6 think tanks which talk about it. They write white papers. They send those papers to the various ministerial agencies, hoping that somebody would read them. And that is how the discourse happens. Then a law comes, then a response is invited, then everybody goes around writing responses, then responses are mailed, and the wider public, let alone the political process, is completely unconnected with this, and that I think is horrible. Till this happens, we can't stop this. We can't stop the companies, because at the end of the day, the companies are operating out of market logic. And market logic is a very strong thing. You can't stop it without mass politics. You can't stop it as an activist. Activism is not going to be enough. I'm not saying activism is not useful. RTI activists have done a lot. Activists who have been filing cases have done a lot. But that is not where we can stop till the people don't understand what is happening. And you have to boil it down to a language which is understandable. See, I came back to this country. I was an AI scientist. I was not originally an AI policy person. I was an AI scientist in America. I came back because I realized that there is an absolute dearth of scholarship in this area in India, in AI policy. And when I came here, and I talked to students in my class. These are not dumb kids. These are kids at IIT. They have they have a certain degree of sharpness. They know a lot, but even they get surprised by the things taught in the class. They get horrified. They're like, how do we survive this workplace if we are going to graduate and become engineers in this kind of an environment? Well, India is a country of engineers, as everybody is fond of telling everybody else, right? Like Tech India and all that. We have a country of millions of engineers. Are those millions of engineers aware how they are being exploited or what technologies are used? I think if we can make the common employee aware of their rights, and if we could educate them, if we do because we are very good at organizing and activist stuff. I think India has a lot of organizations which are excellent at that, which do good activism. But we need good educators for common people. Because what has happened is that on one hand, you have the policy wonk conversation, which is its own world. Then you have the academia conversation, which is its own world. By the way, the policy wonks and the academics also rarely talk. Like our conversation itself is rare, right? Like a professor talking to an organization doesn't really happen that much, because at IIT there are so many AI professors. I do talk to them that, hey, are you interested in like a bit of outreach and etc. Just getting that done is like getting people interested is hard. And just activists talking to academics is not enough. Academics and activists need to boil this down and talk to people outside of their pedagogic pipeline and their circles, which sometimes look very mutually congratulatory. We have the same 5, 6 venues. You published a paper in one of them. Very good, you have a fact 2022 publication coming. Yeah, that is not going to help. We need to do way better than that. And I have been trying in my own little ways. I do a lot of this outside of my academic comfort zone. I run a study circle and I do these outreach things, but it again can't become it can't be an individual thing. We need to build organizations which are like fundamentally prepared to spend time, money, effort, bandwidth to educate people on these things. I think IFF is doing a wonderful job at that. IFF is trying to popularize some of these issues. IFF has a very good social media game. Now, social media itself is an elite garden. It's this walled elite garden of 2-3 million people, which keeps out the hundreds of millions of people outside. It's still better than, you know, uh, closed room wonk discussions where you have the same 200 people, all of whose faces you're probably tired of looking at this point. So that I think is what is missing and what needs to be done. That the place where these technologies are coming through are through market logic. Market logic can only be defeated by political logic, by regulation, by laws, by getting the politicians on your side. Right now, the politicians are not on your side. They are on the side of the tech monopolies, the corporates. They are completely happy with what is going on. To make the politicians change tack, you have to hit where it hurts, their votes. To make that happen, you need to get the common employee get concerned about this, concerned enough to create fuss, concerned enough to threaten to join trade unions, concerned enough to hit the bottom line of the companies. If you can do that, then I think you can make them change.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for that. I definitely agree that, one of the biggest issues is the lack of public awareness around these topics. A lot of people don't know what is happening and how they are being surveilled, when they are being surveilled, and the extent of the surveillance that they are undergoing. So in the absence of that knowledge, expecting them to be worried about this issue is something that is illogical. Which also brings me to another facet of our conversation that we've had previously, in other calls that we've been on, and this is moving away from workplace surveillance and talking about general surveillance, also because you did mention facial recognition, and IFF has a facial recognition project called Project Panoptic, which tracks facial recognition throughout the country of India. I just want you, because you are an AI researcher, you've been an AI scientist, and now you're working here. I want you to break it down for our audience. Can technology such as facial recognition, which is increasingly be used for surveillance and crime investigation by the police, ever be completely accurate? What are certain myths?
It can't. So this is like, this is one of those issues which really angers and aside from what are the, because once I start ranting, I will rant for 5 minutes. So aside from myths and whether it can be accurate, do you have additions to this question?
No, I just wanted to ask you what are certain myths around AI, how AI functions, that you think need to be put to rest. So this is where I provide you with the opportunity to rant. Please.
All right. So now I'm going to stop being academic and start being angry uncle who is yelling at the sky, so to speak. The biggest myths around facial recognition tech sometimes are perpetuated by people who critique the facial recognition tech. What I mean is that they are critiquing it in a way which is harmful. They are critiquing it in a way which accepts the priors which have been placed in front of them by the companies which are promoting facial recognition tech for policing and other such harmful purposes. One of the biggest myths is the myth of transference. There is this idea that explainable, transparent, auditable facial recognition tech is possible. It's not. It's not really. Anybody who tells you that is fraud. They don't know machine learning. They are making claims which they can't back up. I'm sorry, but it's not. Yes, explainable AI is this upcoming and radical area of research, but it's nowhere near that powerful as deep learning yet. And most deep learning 99% deep learning is not just a stochastic process, it's a mathematically impenetrable stochastic process. What that phrase means is that not only is it random, it's random in a way that why it gave you a result you can't find out. What does this mean? This means that we can't make these legal policy analogs to it. You can demand a piece of legislation or policy or procedure or company rubric to be transparent and auditable. You can say that, can you show me how you came to this conclusion? But if I am an AI researcher and I have created a facial recognition tech and I'm a good person, and you ask me that why did this AI facial recognition tech identify me as a criminal when I'm innocent, I can't tell you the answer. I can give you the whole code. I can give you the whole data set. But you will have to retrain the code on the data set. It will create an impenetrable mathematical model called a deep learning model. And unless you have supercomputers and a lot of time, millions of years, you are not going to go through every single mathematical permutation and combination of that model to come to that exact result and figure out why you came to that. So no, it is not transparent in the sense the word is used by policy. You know, when policymakers keep using these three magical phrases, fairness, accountability, transparency, fairness, accountability, transparency, fairness, accountability, transparency, I think they play the game which the companies want you to play when you use that framework. Because no, it can't be transparent. Just policy people need to get it through their head that keep demanding transparency is a waste of time. Stop demanding explainability. It's not going to happen. It is a red herring. It's a very clever red herring because it comes so close but is so far, right? Similarly, fairness. Again, yes, these systems are biased. Yes, you can do certain things to make them less biased, but can you completely remove bias? No, you can't. And you shouldn't, because all machine learning is biased. At the end of the day, you are making decisions. You can't make decisions if you are not biased. Like being completely neutral on completely everything would cause you to not make decisions. So yes, there are tomes being written by AI scientists on how we can make things less biased, on fairness, etc. Completely wrong tree to bark. Why? Because no matter how fair you make it, how transparent you make it, at the end of the day, machine learning is stochastic. What does the word stochastic means? It means it's probabilistic. It will give you always error. It can become 99.99999% accurate, will still give you error. And that error would be probabilistic, which means you don't even know when that error would happen, right? Such a system should not be used for anything which involves law and crime. Crime and law cannot be dependent on things which are probabilistic in nature. Because when a thing goes wrong, when a police officer makes the incorrect call, when a lawyer or a judge makes an incorrect call, a human can be held accountable. You can pinpoint responsibility to a human. You can ask for procedures to be improved. You can ask for people to be sacked. All of that is possible. But a machine which will always make errors and always make it probabilistically, you can't give that thing moral agency. You can't like expect accountability from a machine. What would you do? It will give you a wrong answer, and then somebody's life is going to get ruined, and you will take an algorithm to court and be like, my lord, the machine gave a wrong answer. So what can you do about it? And the point that once you start replacing human beings with decision-making machines, especially machines which are probabilistic and stochastic, which make errors, you remove the officer from responsibility. If the officer goes and arrests somebody, and even if they're aware that they don't have due cause, but if they can say the machine told me so, I believed it, what can you do against that? We have, this is again not rhetorical, this is again not something I'm speaking as a future hypothetical. This has been observed. Vidushi Marda wrote a paper recently on how data is being collected for machine learning purposes for Delhi police, for example. What she found was that there were multiple levels of arbitrariness. Recently, you had Punjab police and Hyderabad police and Assam police all using facial recognition tech or other allied machine learning technologies. And they shouldn't be. They're using it in ways, even if you look at it at a very surface level, you would understand how arbitrary the whole thing is. So that would be my rant for
No, that's a much needed rant. And that is something that we've been trying to explain through our project as well, that it should not be used by the police, because the harm that would occur is irreversible. But just to flip that coin, is all AI bad, and what are certain uses of AI that you think may be beneficial?
I keep getting this question, which is really weird because I am an AI scientist. I have sort of dedicated my whole life to, and like once you become an academic, there's no going back, right? So if I thought that all AI is bad, I would have not become an AI scientist. I would have become an anti-AI activist or something. I'm not. In fact, I don't think people should oppose technology because I think that is silly. And people did that in the 80s when you had the first wave of digitization. What happened was that the progressives got completely kicked out of the discourse. The discourse was taken up by basically completely neoliberal pro-market forces, and you lost a bunch of worker rights. I think that way of thinking, that is AI good or AI bad, it's silly because AI is a tool. How it is used, it's like saying, is electricity good, is electricity bad, right? And as famously some scientist had said, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but I know you will figure out a way to tax it. So the same with AI, right? It depends on how you use it. If you are using it to police, to do judiciary functions, to do policy making, of course, that is something one should not do. Like I just said, you should not have arbitrary processes in these things. If you are using AI in the workplace to essentially, and I would stress this, unscientifically harass workers by random and arbitrary standards of performance, which is what digital Taylorism is, that is also bad. But those are a microscopic, handful of use cases compared to ways in which AI could be useful. There are farmers who have used machine learning to predict when the next pestilence or frostbite would happen and hence saved their crops. There are people who are using AI to find the prospects of natural disasters and storms striking coasts using images from satellites, etc. There are people who are using language tech and natural language processing in AI to preserve rare, like books written in rare languages which need to be transcribed, which if done by human beings would take decades, but done by machinery would take hours, and thus are preserving vital pieces of culture and heritage. There are people who are figuring out how to use AI to reduce work, not to decrease wages or fire people, but reduce work in a sort of a democratic communal fashion. These places are called collectives and cooperatives. There are things called digital cooperatives, and these things are increasing worker agency, skill, and power. Right? By the way, I don't think that cooperatives are be all and end all answers, because they still have to operate within market logic, and they also have to exploit themselves and other people, because ultimately market logic is something which I said you can't fight purely at a technology level. But there are good uses of technology. What matters is what uses and designs are funded and what aren't. That is not a technological decision. That at the end of the day is a societal political decision. Which use cases we decide, which problems we decide to fund in our academic labs, what sort of people do we promote, what sort of technologies do we promote. And that is where the problem arises. If you have, for example, funding for these projects in a dominant fashion at a global rate comes from powerful monopolistic companies, 4 or 5 companies which give the largest grants: Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Netflix. Same 4 or 5 companies, right? Why would they promote research which will not benefit their margins, right? Why would they um, make research happen which is not ultimately benefiting them? So what is the alternative? The alternative is that various governments pour money into education, research, new universities, new labs, etc. At an era where we are seeing more and more privatization of education. What is rather needed is building of more campuses, massively increasing seats, pouring money into education, and preparing the population for this cutthroat era of uh, 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 this sort of capitalism which these companies are promoting. You can't do that without a societal level change of ethos on what we want to pour our money on. You can't do that if the state capitulates on its welfare responsibilities and says that, oh, the platforms are doing things, that is fine, they can do healthcare, they can do transportation, they can make smart cities. We are not going to do the basic functions which we have been elected to do in the first place. So I think while technology can have a lot of good usages, to enable those usages, the question is, who owns the purse strings, who owns the technology, who owns the wallet? And till that is not changed, till the electorate does not force the state to care about these things, to invest as much and more money than the companies are investing, then unfortunately academics would be beholden to companies, and they would be beholden to work on projects which might be societally, economically, and ethically dicey.
Thank you, Professor, for that. And this is my last question. And you've already touched upon this, but just to expand on that a little bit, where do you think the Indian policy landscape on regulating AI needs to go? Right now, we don't have anything as
right now we don't have any.
So where do you think it needs to go?
In a way, starting from a blank slate is not that bad. I mean, if people want to do the correct thing, I think the policy making around AI first needs to acknowledge that there can be policy making around it, right? There is this idea which people have that no, you can't like ban things. It will harm innovation. As an AI scientist, let me tell you, it will do none of that. It is like, sorry, innovation is not when market free. That is a very silly idea which some people have. Freer the market, more the innovation. No, that's not how it works. That's not how it really works. So governance is required around it. Just the acknowledgement that democratic oversight is needed around AI, that needs to be accepted by the state first. Then there needs to be consultation with academics, civil society actors, but most importantly, the people who are impacted by the AI systems. You can't have policy making without asking the people. Hey, this is actually a big problem we have had in the past with tech policy making. I'm not talking about AI, but previous tech policy making. We call these multi-stakeholder models. But if you actually look at the model, you have the NGOs, you have the think tanks, you have the bureaucrats, you have the politicians. What is missing is the public, the people who are going to ultimately be most affected. So you can't have good policy making without involving the people who are going to be affected. For example, today we were talking about AI at the workplace. Who does the workplace affect the most? The employees. If you don't have employee representatives, if you don't have trade union representatives, if you don't have engineers, if you don't have white collar, blue collar, all kinds of workers being involved in the policy making around the mechanisms that will govern their work, what are you doing essentially? right? It's not that their representatives don't exist or such organizations don't exist which talk for employees and workers. We have not just trade unions, but even trade unions of tech workers these days, right? There are organizations which can be consulted. Similarly, it's not that there are no academics who don't understand AI. Come to any campus, come to my IIT Bombay, go to Triple IT Delhi, go to any campus where people are working on AI. We would tell you what works, what doesn't work, what is probably snake oil, etc. There are both technology academics, policy academics, humanities academics, economics academics you can find at places. Then there are organizations like yours, which have been working on the ground, which have been um, fighting in the courts, which understand societal and policy implications of these things. So people do exist from whom a state can ask how to make policy. The question is the will to make policy, and that will only comes when a thing becomes politically important enough to care about. We have seen this happen in the European Union. Enough people protested and enough people made noise that today not only do you have GDPR, which is one of the finest piece of, I won't say the GDPR does not have issues. I would be the first person to critique it as an academic, but look at the alternatives, look at every other regime which exists, right? Compared to that, GDPR is like heaven. It says that you can't be governed by an algorithm without your consent. Which other country has something like that? So the sort of discourse around data rights, AI, algorithm that exists in Europe, that happened because the public pressured the states. Today, you see, after a lot of fighting in both Europe and in UK, you have courts challenging the platforms. You have courts saying that Uber workers are actually workers. They are not associates or whatever nonsense a word you want to use. You have to give them workers' rights, etc. This is possible, right? This is not utopian. This is extremely possible. But we have to create the sort of public pressure and public education. And there have been cases in the past when people have managed to do it. I remember when net neutrality came under peril and civil society got its act together and it managed to educate a significant amount of the public through there were memes, there were YouTube videos, there were God knows what, and people knew about net neutrality. I was just a student at that time, but my classmates knew what the whole deal was about. People knew that, oh, this is a thing and we need to do something about that. Well, AI needs to be taught to the people. Now, one thing I have realized as an academic who teaches AI policy, I have two kinds of students who come to my class. Students who are policy students or social science students who want to understand the technology because they have not been exposed to the technological aspect, and engineers, students from computer science and other engineering departments who want to understand the social impact aspect. And both these set of students, they're completely convinced they will never be able to learn the other thing. Like the engineer, like, oh, this stuff is so hard, like social science theory. I have never read Karl Marx. How would I ever, understand how society works? And the social science students are like, oh, coding is really hard. I don't know. Could you just teach the theory? I don't want to do the coding. And I force them to, like, I have 2 classes a week, and in one I teach theory, in the other I teach coding. And what I have realized is that people learn. It's easy to teach. Indians have been habituated, I think, hypnotized to think that learning new things is hard, that AI is this mysterious thing. Let the experts talk amongst themselves. You are a plebe. What would you know about AI, right? And people believe that. And then they are sold snake oil. You have 5 people on a panel on some news channel talking about AI, and then you are like, who are these 5 people again? One is an MBA, one is a NASCOM rep, one, like, the talking heads, even they don't know anything about AI, but they are confidently using phrases, and you as an AI scientist are cringing. And then you have the mass of people who are like, oh, we don't know what is this. Not only we don't know, but we are scared and we don't think we will ever know. That, I think, it's a responsibility of every single academic to work towards curing that. Like, I think if we can get the public education part right, other things would follow.
Definitely, definitely. Completely agree with you there. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming to talk to me and the IFF community today and for shedding light on this increasingly important topic. At IFF, we hope to continue to host subject matter experts like yourselves to ensure that our community can benefit from your insights on these niche subjects that you work on.
Thank you so much, Anushka and the IFF for inviting me. And really happy that you guys did, and we managed to have this talk. I mean, writing papers is a thing, but trying to explain the paper to a wider audience, it's a very, I think, something I feel very strongly. Thanks.
Thank you. Definitely, we're very happy that you came and you explained and you broke down these concepts for our community. If you like this event today and would like to participate in these conversations, consider becoming an IFF member today. Thank you to everyone who joined the event today, and stay tuned for the next one. We're now going to turn off the live stream and allow IFF members